What if I told you a man reached the shoulder of death on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, only to vanish before he could take his next breath? A climber so determined, so close to glory, yet within seconds, everything turned into horror. This isn't just a fall. It is a story about the thin line between triumph and tragedy, and how one wrong move above the bottleneck can erase a lifetime of dreams. This is the story of Sergey Glazunov, the Russian climber who conquered the impossible, but never came back to tell the tale. Welcome to K2 Stories, where every summit has a price, and some climbers pay it in full. The year was 2022. While the world was busy watching other mountains of ambition, politics, fame, money, a small team of Russian climbers quietly made their way toward K2, the savage mountain. Sergey Glazunov and his partner Andrei Baranov weren't celebrities. They weren't backed by sponsors or fame. They were pure climbers, driven by passion, skill, and something far deeper than glory, a hunger for the unknown. But on K2, hunger alone isn't enough. The mountain doesn't care about your strength. It doesn't care about your dreams, your family waiting at home, or the flags you carry. On K2, the only thing that matters is survival. As Sergey and Andrei set their sights on the summit, they didn't know that within a matter of hours, one of them would be hanging between life and death, and the other would vanish forever into the clouds. Stay with me, because what happened next will make you question, why do climbers still chase the deadliest mountain on Earth? If you love true mountain stories like this, hit subscribe and let us climb deeper into the mystery of Sergey Glazunov's final ascent. The morning of July 22, 2022, began like many others at Camp 4, silent, breathless, and cruelly cold. At 7,900 meters, everything was stripped to its essence: wind, ice, and the dull rhythm of your heartbeat echoing inside the oxygen-starved void of your helmet. Sergey Glazunov sat on his pack, staring at the shadowed ridge ahead, the final stretch before the summit of K2. Beside him, Andrei Baranov checked their ropes one last time, his breath fogging in the dim blue light of dawn. No guides, no oxygen, no support team. Just two Russians against the mountain that had buried hundreds before them. They had planned to climb in pure alpine style, fast, light, and unassisted. It was the kind of climbing that left no room for error. Every move mattered. Every knot tied or untied could mean the difference between standing on the top of the world or becoming part of the mountain forever. And Sergey, tall, calm, almost stoic, had a quiet confidence about him. To the few climbers who had crossed paths with the duo lower on the mountain, Sergey seemed almost too calm. He smiled politely, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, something only he could see. "We go for summit today," he told a Pakistani climber at Camp 4. "If weather holds, we make it." Those were the last words anyone outside their team would ever hear from him. The Bottleneck, that infamous almost vertical gully beneath a hanging glacier of Sarax, was waiting for them. Every climber who approaches it knows the truth. If you get caught there when the ice moves, you don't survive. It is the most feared place on K2, a death trap suspended between the heavens and hell. The two men began their climb around 8 a.m., moving cautiously, placing protection as they advanced. The ice was hard as stone. The ropes they carried, thin lifelines in this vast white tomb, snaked upward into the blue. Step by step, they climbed beyond exhaustion, each swing of the axe echoing like a heartbeat in the thin air. By midday, they had passed the Bottleneck. Against all odds, they had cleared the most dangerous section. Now, above them, the pyramid summit glittered like a dream. The weather, unusually clear. The wind, calm. Everything seemed perfect. At 2:30 p.m., Sergey radioed a short message to base camp. "We are on the summit." It was victory. After days of suffering, frostbite, and fear, they had done what many failed to do: reach the top of K2, the savage mountain. But for every climber who touches that icy crown, the real danger is not going up. It's coming down. As the wind began to rise, Sergey and Andrei knew they had to move fast. The light was fading. Clouds started to roll in from the south, thin at first, then thicker, swallowing the mountain below. Visibility dropped. The same path they had so carefully followed now disappeared into a white void. Descending K2 is like descending through death itself. Every step down feels heavier, every anchor point uncertain. And when exhaustion sets in, mistakes multiply. At 8,000 meters, Andrei slipped. He caught himself, barely, digging his crampons into the ice. Sergey moved to secure the line, his movements precise but slower now. They spoke little, conserving oxygen, even though they had none to spare. Somewhere above the bottleneck they realized the fixed ropes they had relied on earlier were gone, either buried under snow or torn loose by the wind. They were on their own. Darkness fell. Sergey's headlamp flickered across the ice wall, ghostly shapes of seracs looming overhead. He turned to Andrei and said something that still echoes in Baranov's memory. "If we stop now, we die. We go." And they went. Into the dark, into the storm, into the silence that waits for every climber who dares to challenge K2. Hours later, only one of them would still be alive to tell what happened next. And even he barely made it back. By nightfall, the mountain had transformed. What had been a shimmering white cathedral under sunlight was now a black, howling void. Wind screamed through the ice walls, tearing at ropes, ripping at clothing, battering the two men clinging to K2's upper slopes. Sergey Glazunov and Andrei Baranov were descending blind. The glow from their headlamps barely reached beyond their boots, only revealing shards of ice whipping past in the storm. Snow blew upward, not downward. That's how fierce the wind was. Somewhere below them was the bottleneck, a near-vertical chute framed by hanging glaciers that could collapse without warning. Every climber who ever stood there knew the truth. The bottleneck doesn't forgive. And now, Sergey and Andrei were trapped above it, exhausted, disoriented, and dangerously low on energy. "Sergey!" Baranov shouted into the wind, but his voice was swallowed whole. His hands were numb. He could barely feel the rope he was trying to clip into an old anchor half buried in rime ice. Sergey moved like a ghost in front of him, methodical, silent, laser-focused. He knew they had to reach the fixed ropes below. Without them, the descent would turn suicidal. But when he reached the next anchor, there was nothing. No rope, just a frayed end fluttering in the storm, torn clean by icefall or wind. Baranov saw Sergey pause, then slowly shake his head. In that moment, he understood. They were completely on their own, hanging thousands of feet above the void, in the dark, with no guide ropes to safety. "We'll rappel on our rope," Sergey finally said, his voice hoarse through the radio. "One anchor, then we go again. No choice. No choice." Two words that meant everything on K2. They set up the rappel. The storm roared. Andrei went first, sliding down the icy face, boots scraping, rope groaning under the strain. He could feel it trembling, creaking, biting into the ice like a living thing. "Off rope," he shouted when he reached a small ledge below. Then, silence. Just the wind. Above him, Sergey began his descent. Baranov looked up and saw a faint light moving downward. Slow, controlled. Then, without warning, it stopped. A sharp snap. A sound no climber ever wants to hear. Then, nothing. For one frozen heartbeat, Andrei thought maybe it was the rope scraping ice. But then the faint beam of Sergey's headlamp started to fall, tumbling, spinning wildly until it disappeared into the darkness below. "Sergey! Sergey!" Baranov screamed until his throat tore. No answer. Only the howling wind and the echo of his own panic. He pulled on the rope. Nothing. Slack. He pulled harder. Still nothing. The rope had snapped clean. And just like that, Sergey Glazunov, one of Russia's finest alpinists, was gone. Baranov froze, unable to process what had happened. He wanted to believe Sergey had landed on a ledge, that maybe he was alive, hurt, but breathing. But deep down, he knew. On K2, a fall from that height, doesn't leave miracles. The realization came like an avalanche. He was now alone. Alone in the death zone, at night, with no rope, no partner, no line to safety. He clipped himself into an old anchor, a rusted screw that looked like it had not been touched in years, and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. He didn't move. Couldn't. He felt his eyelids freezing shut, his fingers stiffening. Just wait till morning, he told himself. Wait, then move. But as the temperature plunged below 30 degrees Celsius, Baranov began to lose the sense of time and self. The storm howled like a living creature, whispering in his ears, "Sleep, Andrei. Rest. It's over." He shook his head violently, slapped his face, forced himself to stay awake. Every few minutes he tapped his legs and arms, just to feel something. He thought of Sergey, his calm voice, his small smile that morning. He thought of his family back home, who had no idea what was happening thousands of miles above them. And most of all, he thought of the mountain, silent, merciless, eternal. He spoke out loud, to no one. "Why, Sergey? Why didn't we wait for daylight?" The question drifted into the storm. No answer came. At first light, Baranov began to move again. His body screamed with pain. Frostbite had set in. But he didn't care anymore. He had only one thought: down. Each step was agony. He descended blindly, following instinct more than memory. And somehow, miraculously, he made it through the bottleneck. Alive. When rescuers finally spotted him from below, staggering and half-conscious, they couldn't believe it. A lone figure emerging from the clouds, clothes. When the storm finally broke, the mountain was silent again. No wind, no roar, just an endless frozen world, white and cruelly beautiful. Andrei Baranov opened his eyes to the morning light. He wasn't sure if he'd slept or passed out. His tent was gone, his rope and half buried under snow. His partner, gone forever. He was a man alone on the world's deadliest mountain, stranded in the death zone, where the human body slowly consumes itself. His oxygen levels were crashing. His gloves were stiff with ice. His mind, drifting between lucidity and delirium. He looked down the slope that vanished into clouds and whispered hoarsely, "Sergey, I'm sorry." But there was no echo. Only the quiet hiss of wind and the groan of shifting ice. Baranov began to move inch by inch, dragging his frozen body down the slope. His crampons scraped over blue ice. His axe hit sparks off rock beneath. He followed his instincts, not a trail, not a rope, but the faint memory of descent. Every few steps he'd collapse to his knees. His vision blurred. His lungs burned like fire. Somewhere below he thought he heard voices. They came faintly through the wind, not human, not clear, more like ghosts whispering from the abyss. He shouted, but no one answered. So he kept walking. Because on K2, stopping means death. Hours blurred into one another. He lost track of time, of distance, of pain. By late afternoon, he reached a narrow section of ice, a place he vaguely remembered climbing 2 days earlier. But now it was different. The storm had reshaped everything. The fixed ropes were gone, buried or snapped. He tied his remaining rope around an old piton hammered into the ice and rappelled, praying it would hold. Halfway down, the anchor began to creak. He froze. Every fiber of his body screamed, "Don't move." Below him, nothing but the void. Above, a sky too white to distinguish from snow. For 10 full minutes, he didn't move a muscle. He whispered to himself, "One more. Just one more rappel." When he finally reached the ledge below, he collapsed face first into the snow, sobbing, not from fear, but from something deeper. Survivor's guilt. He had made it through what Sergey had not, and he didn't know why. The next morning, 2 Pakistani high-altitude porters from a nearby team spotted movement near the shoulder below the bottleneck. At first, they thought it was debris from the storm. But then, a faint motion. "There! Someone alive!" one of them shouted through the radio. It was Baranov, half-conscious, frostbitten, leaning against a rock like a statue. When they reached him, he didn't recognize them. He mumbled something over and over, barely audible. The rope broke. Sergey fell. He fell. They gave him oxygen. They wrapped him in thermal blankets. But his eyes, hollow, vacant, told them everything before he even spoke. The descent from Camp Bafour to base camp took nearly 2 days. Baranov could barely walk. His frostbitten hands were blackened, his lips split and bleeding. But he refused a stretcher, insisted on walking himself, even if he stumbled every few meters. He wanted to finish the descent, to feel the ground again, to stand where Sergey never would. When he finally reached base camp, other climbers gathered quietly around. No one cheered. No one asked questions. He sat down in the snow, took a deep breath of thick air for the first time in days, and whispered, "He's gone." The rope snapped. He was right above me. Silence fell over the entire camp. Even the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Days later, when the storm cleared completely, a small recovery team ventured up the glacier below the Bottleneck. They found Sergey's body resting on the ice, harness still clipped, rope still attached. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't fought. The fall had been instant. When the team reported back to base camp, Baranov turned away. He couldn't bear to hear the details. "He was the strongest of us," he said softly. "He didn't deserve that." But on K2, deserving has nothing to do with it. Back in Russia, the climbing community was shaken. Sergey Glazunov wasn't a reckless amateur. He was one of the country's most respected young alpinists. At just 36, he had summited peaks that most climbers only dream about. Peak Lenin, Kangchenjunga, and several first ascents in the Pamirs. He was known for his discipline, precision, and calm. Not the kind of man who made careless mistakes. That made his death even harder to accept. Some questioned the decision to climb alpine style, without oxygen or Sherpa support. Others blamed the weather, or bad luck, or fate. But those who knew K2 best said the same thing. You can do everything right, and still die. Because on K2, even perfection isn't enough. Baranov returned home weeks later, his frostbitten fingers still healing, his mind fractured by what he'd seen. He rarely spoke publicly about that night. When he did, his words were few. We reached the summit, but the mountain, it chose who would come back. He carried Sergey's memory with him everywhere, a quiet burden, an unspoken promise. He had witnessed the moment when life was reduced to a single sound, the snap of a rope. And every night after, he would wake up to that same sound echoing in his dreams. In an interview months later, when asked if he would ever climb K2 again, Baranov looked into the distance, eyes tired, voice trembling, and said, "No, you don't climb the same mountain twice when it takes your friend. You just remember." And then he smiled faintly as if speaking to Sergey through the wind. He's still up there. The mountain keeps him now. Far above, the news traveled slowly down the Karakoram. By the time it reached Skardu, the nearest city, word had already spread across every radio frequency used by climbers that season. A Russian climber has fallen on descent. One survivor, Andrei Baranov. No one needed to ask who. Everyone on K2 in 2022 knew Sergey Glazunov. He wasn't a celebrity mountaineer, but his reputation preceded him. A quiet, methodical man with ice in his veins and purpose in his eyes. He wasn't chasing fame or records. He was chasing purity, the essence of climbing. And now, the man who sought purity had become a ghost of the savage mountain. At base camp, the flags were lowered halfway on the tents. A memorial was held, not with speeches or fanfare, but with silence. Baranov stood at the edge of the moraine, wrapped in a thick parka, staring up at the mountain that had taken his partner. He didn't cry. He just watched as the wind swept snow down the face of K2, like white smoke rising from a funeral pyre. A Pakistani porter placed a small stone cairn near the glacier. Atop it, someone left a broken ice axe. No words, no ceremony. Because on K2, death is neither unexpected nor rare. It is a companion that walks beside every climber from the first step to the last. But even in that cold silence, Sergey's story began to ripple far beyond the mountain. When the news reached Russia, it hit the climbing community like a hammer. Sergey was more than an athlete. He was a teacher, a mentor, an idealist. He'd taught dozens of younger climbers how to move through the mountains like they were part of them. Not invaders, but students. Social media lit up with his photos. Sergey smiling shyly in his red jacket, ice axe slung over his shoulder, standing beneath the peaks of the Pamirs. The caption most shared read, "He lived without fear and died without regret." But Baranov couldn't agree with that. He couldn't see the poetry in what had happened. He could only see the image that replayed endlessly in his mind, Sergey's headlamp tumbling into the dark, then vanishing forever. Weeks later, back in Moscow, Baranov attended a memorial held by the Russian Mountaineering Federation. Friends spoke of Sergey's strength, his composure, his devotion to the sport. They called his death a tragic accident in pursuit of greatness. Baranov said nothing until the very end. When it was his turn to speak, he simply walked to the podium and stared at the crowd, hundreds of faces, all waiting to hear the story from the man who survived. He began quietly. "We reached the summit. We did everything by the book, but the mountain, it doesn't follow rules." His voice cracked slightly. He didn't panic. He didn't make mistakes. The rope just snapped. That's all. And I've been hearing that sound every night since. He paused, took a breath, and added, almost to himself, "People ask why we climb, but that's the wrong question. The question is, why do we fall? And maybe we fall because mountains remind us that we're human." When he stepped down, there was only silence, the kind that cuts deeper than applause ever could. In the months that followed, Sergey's name became more than just a tragedy. It became a symbol for purity in climbing, for risk, for the beauty and cruelty of obsession. Articles debated his choices. Was it foolish to climb alpine style without oxygen or fixed lines? Was it heroism or hubris? Some said he was reckless. Others said he was brave beyond measure. But for those who knew him, Sergey's climb was neither. It was simply inevitable. He was always meant to face that mountain, just as the mountain was meant to test him. That same year, more climbers summited K2 than ever before. Teams lined the slopes, ropes stretched across the bottleneck, lights twinkled like a string of stars along the ridge. But when they passed the section where Sergey fell, something strange happened. Every single climber went quiet. The air seemed to thicken. The sound of their crampons softened. No one spoke his name, but everyone felt it. That invisible weight that lingers where courage and death meet. A few climbers said they saw his old carabiner still clipped to an anchor, rusted, frozen in time. A silent reminder that somewhere in that vertical graveyard of ice and stone, a man once stood here, full of life. In interviews later, Baranov described how it felt to return home. You come back to the city and everyone moves so fast. Lights, noise, cars, but you can still hear the wind from K2. It never leaves you. He lived quietly after that, avoiding publicity, rarely climbing high mountains again. When asked what he missed most about Sergey, he didn't hesitate. His calm. Even when the world was collapsing, he was steady. He never feared the mountain. He respected it. Then he added softly, "They say the mountain never lies. It doesn't promise safety. It doesn't care who you are, how much you've trained, or how many prayers you whisper into the wind." K2 tells the truth, brutally, coldly, without apology. And when Sergey Glazunov fell in 2022, the truth echoed through every camp, every climber, every family that ever waited by a satellite phone for a voice that would never call again. Months later, long after the ice melted from the lower slopes, a group of climbers found something near the foot of the bottleneck, a piece of weathered rope, frayed and frozen into the glacier. At one end, a small metal tag with initials scratched into it, SG. They left it there. Because on K2, you don't take from the mountain. You leave it as a sign, as a memory, as respect. Some said that was all that remained of Sergey. But those who believe in the spirit of mountains know better. They say Sergey is still there, not buried, not lost, but woven into the mountain itself. Every gust of wind that howls down the bottleneck carries his breath. Every crack of ice underfoot whispers his name. He became part of the story, part of the legend that warns and inspires all who come after. Years from now, another climber will stand beneath K2's shadow, staring at that towering pyramid of death and wonder. He'll hear the stories of the men who fell, the ones who froze, and the few who lived to tell. And maybe, just maybe, he'll pause, look up, and feel that invisible presence in the wind. A voice that says, "Don't underestimate her. She takes what she wants." Because K2 keeps its own. Sergey Glazunov's story isn't just about a fall. It's about devotion, about the human need to touch something eternal, even if it burns us in the process. And for those who listen, who still believe that mountains hold more than stone and snow, Sergey's story reminds us. There are places on this planet where courage and consequence are the same thing. If this story reached you, if it made you pause even for a second, subscribe to K2 Stories, where we keep alive the voices of those who dared to climb the savage mountain and never came back. Because every summit has a price, and every story deserves to be remembered. This was The Fall of Sergey Glazunov. Thank you for listening.